Chapter 11 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 11. Charles Francis Hall and the North Pole. Among the many exploring expeditions that have crossed the Arctic Circle with the sole view of reaching the North Pole, one only has sailed entirely under the auspices of the United States. This expedition was commanded neither by an officer of one of the twin military services nor by a sailor of the merchant marine, but its control was entrusted to a born Arctic explorer, Charles Francis Hall. Born in 1821 in Rochester, New Hampshire, Hall early quitted his native hills for the freer fields of the West, as the Ohio Valley was then called, and later settled in Cincinnati. There was never a spirit of change in him, and as years rolled on, he passed from blacksmith to journalist, from stationer to engraver. Through all these changes of trades he held fast to one fancy, which in time became the dominating element of his eventful career. In early youth, fascinated with books of travel relating to exploration in the icy zones, he eagerly improved every opportunity to increase his Arctic library, which steadily grew despite his very limited resources. His interest in the fate of Franklin was so intense that he followed with impatience the slow and uncertain efforts for the relief of the lost explorer. Not content with mere sympathy, he also planned an American search, to be conducted in Her Majesty's ship Resolute. Learning in 1859 that this Arctic ship was laid up and dismantled, he originated a petition asking that it be loaned for such purpose. The return of McClintock with definite news of the death of Franklin and the retreat and loss of his expeditionary force put an end to the petition. Hall, however, despite the admirable and convincing report of McClintock, persisted in the belief that some members of Franklin's crew were yet alive, and he determined to solve the problem by visiting King William Land, the scene of the final disaster. He issued circulars asking public aid, diligently sought out whalers and explorers who could give him their personal experiences, and finally determined that he must go and live with the Eskimo, and, conforming to their modes of travel and existence, work out his Arctic problem on new lines. The inauguration of the plan presented difficulties, for Hall was without means, but his persistent action created confidence, and a modest outfit for the voyage was procured through friendly contributions, while passage on a whaler for himself and baggage was tendered. On July 30, 1860, with a whaleboat and scanty supplies, Hall landed alone on the west coast of Davis Strait in Frobisher Bay. His base of operations was Rescue Harbor, 63° north, 65° west, whence he made a series of sledge journeys during the 2 years passed in this region. He re-examined the coasts visited by Frobisher in his eventful voyages of 1575 to 1579, and found the famous gold mine on Meta Incognita, whence 1,300 tons of ore were carried to England, where, as the chronicles relate, in the melting and refining 16 tons whereof proceeded 210 ounces of fine silver mixed with gold. An extensive collection of relics of Frobisher's expedition was made, which later was given to the Royal Geographical Society. The expedition of Hall was mainly fruitful in training him for other Arctic work, for though his knowledge was self-acquired and instruments imperfect, yet his indefatigable industry and practice in scientific observations made him a reliable observer by the time of his return. It may be added that his careful and detailed description of the habits and life of the Eskimo of the west coast of Davis Strait are of decided value from his rigid truthfulness, which caused him to record what he saw without exaggeration. Hall's success in obtaining so many relics of Frobisher's voyage of 3 centuries previous, and the fact that the Eskimo yet had traditionary knowledge of that voyage, encouraged Hall and his friends to a confident belief that a voyage to the shores of King William Land would result in the discovery of records, relics, possibly survivors, and in any event rescue the story of the retreat of Crozier from oblivion by hearing it from Eskimo eyewitnesses. Future search operations were to be promoted through his Eskimo followers, commonly known as Joe and Hannah, who returned with him to the United States, and further, Hall relied upon his knowledge of the Eskimo language, in which he had acquired considerable facility during his long sojourn with them. Hall's return was in 1862, and in 1864 he was ready for his second voyage. On August 20th he was landed, with his 2 natives, a whaleboat, tent, and a moderate amount of provisions, on Depot Island, in the extreme northern part of Hudson Bay, in 63° 47' north, 90° west, where Hall began his life and quest that were to last 5 weary years. Preliminary autumnal journeys extended his knowledge, but they were marked by no definite progress, and the summer of 1864 was spent by the natives in securing game for the coming winter, thus postponing Hall's chances of a westward sledge trip to King William Land yet another year. Despairing of assistance from natives near the whaling rendezvous, Hall decided to make his winter quarters in Repulse Bay at Fort Hope, 60° 32' north, 87° west, occupied 1846 47 by the famous explorer Dr. Rae. Here he hoped to secure the friendship of the neighboring Eskimo and lay up stores of game for the final expedition, and there he wintered in 1865 66, during which he secured about 150 reindeer, some salmon, and ptarmigan. With returning spring, the Eskimo promised to make the journey, and with quite a party and several dog sledges, Hall's heart was full of joy and expectation as they moved northward across Rae Peninsula. On March 30th, 1866, his discouragements commenced with the long halts and frequent detours for hunts, and his disappointment was complete when the natives decided to turn back from Cape Weynton, 68° north, 89° west, after having, in 28 days, only traveled as far with dogs as Rae had gone on foot in 5 days. Hall simply records, "My King William party is ended for the present, disappointed but not discouraged." The journey and time were not fruitless, for near Cape Weynton he fell in with 4 strange Eskimo, who gave him most valuable information as to the subject nearest his heart. They related that some of their people had visited the search ships and had seen Franklin. What was more to the point, they produced a considerable number of articles that had once belonged to members of Franklin's party. The most important were silver articles, such as spoons, forks, etc., which bore the crest of Franklin and other officers of the lost expedition. These veritable evidences of the passage of Crozier and others of Franklin's expedition through this region were fortunately secured by Hall, and were later supplemented by many others. Unable to obtain Eskimo assistance the following year, Hall made journeys here and there wherever it was possible, one in February, 1867, to Igloolik, the winter quarters of Perry, in 1822, on Boothia Felix Land, and a second in 1868 to the Strait of Fury and Hecla, discovered by Perry in 1825. Furthermore, he surveyed the northwest coast of Melville Peninsula, and filled in the broken line of the Admiralty chart for the northwest of that peninsula. Visiting whalers urged on Hall the impossibility of succeeding in reaching King William Land by aid of natives, and more than one captain offered to carry him and his party back to the United States. Never despairing of final success, Hall determined to pass another winter at Fort Hope, Repulse Bay. Here, learning by experience, and acquiring food supplies during the winter, he succeeded in March, 1869, in again starting westward with 10 Eskimo, men, women, and children, with well-loaded dog sledges. Progress was slow and delays frequent, but still the journey was continued. Their course from Repulse Bay lay overland, by nearly connecting lakes and rivers, across Rae Peninsula to Committee Bay, thence by another similar overland route over the south end of Boothia Felix Land to James Ross Strait, where King William Land lies some 60 miles to the west. Hall, singularly enough, was never able to appreciate the attitude of the natives in making such a long, dangerous journey merely to please him, for he quaintly complains that the Eskimo had no appreciation of his mission and continually lost valuable time by stopping to smoke and talk. They now objected to go west of Pelly Bay, but by persuasion proceeded to Simpson Island, 68 degrees 30' north, 91 degrees 30' west, where a successful hunt for musk oxen so restored their spirits that they went on. At Point Ackland, on the eastern shore of James Ross Strait, Hall fortunately fell in with natives with whom he remained 9 days, and from whom he obtained important information. Inukpojijuk proved to be the chief man of the party, and from him and others were purchased relics, such as silver spoons, plain and with the crest of Franklin. Hall was told that these articles came from a large island where a great many white men died, and that 5 white men were buried on an island known to the chief. This Eskimo finally agreed to accompany Hall and guided him direct across James Ross Strait to a group of small islets to the east of King William Land, where, on Todd Island, part of a human thigh bone was found, snow covering the ground to such a depth as to make thorough search impossible without long delay. On May 12, 1869, Hall had the supreme pleasure of putting foot on King William Land, the object and end of his 5 years' life among the Eskimo. The only tangible result of the search thereon was the discovery of a human skeleton, and he reluctantly set out on his return. Eskimo were fallen in within Pelly Bay, 68 degrees 30' north, 90 degrees 30' west, and an old man, Tungnuk, on inquiry regarding Franklin relics in their possession, told Hall that the natives had found a ship beset near Kikituk, King William Land, and that in getting wood out of it they made a hole in the ship, which soon after sank. Kobig, another native, said that all the white men perished except 2 at Kikituk, whose fate was unknown. Hall felt satisfied, from the stories of the Eskimo and other evidences, that he was able to determine the fate of 79 out of the 105 men of Crozier's party, which retreated in 1848 from the abandoned ships. The Eskimo told him that Crozier, Franklin's second in command, had passed near their huts, that he had a gun in his hand and a telescope around his neck, and that his men were dragging 2 boats. Crozier told the natives that they were going to Repulse Bay. The Eskimo admitted that they had deserted Crozier owing to the fact that his party was in a starving condition and their food was scarce. As far as Hall could make out, Crozier, late in July, 1848, passed down the west coast of King William Land, with 40 men dragging 2 sledges, and near Cape Herschel fell in with 4 Eskimo families who, after communicating with Crozier, fled from the starving party during the night. From native accounts, Hall was also able to enumerate in detail the points at which the retreating party had died and been buried. Among other relics collected by Hall were portraits of one of the boats, an oak sledge runner, a chronometer box with the Queen's broad arrow engraved thereon, Franklin's mahogany writing desk, and many pieces of silver, forks, spoons, knives, and parts of watches. It was claimed by the natives that one of Franklin's ships made the Northwest Passage with 5 men on board, and in the spring of 1849 was found by them near O'Reilly Island, 88 degrees 30' north, 99 degrees west. Hall had now passed 5 years among the Eskimo, in which time he had made sledge journeys aggregating more than 3,000 miles, acquired a thorough knowledge of the language and methods of life of the natives, and proved the possibility of a white man living the same life and making the same sledge journeys as the natives, but at the same time he became conscious that no very extended sledge work could be done by Eskimo aid alone. His 5 years of arduous Arctic life ended in 1869 by his returning home on an American whaler, bringing with him his faithful Eskimo, Joe and Hannah. Hall's return to the United States was simply, however, to pursue another and greater voyage, in which he believed he would be able to reach the North Pole. After strenuous efforts, he succeeded in interesting the President, the Cabinet, and a large number of Congressmen in his project, and on July 12, 1870, Congress appropriated $50,000 for the purpose of the expedition, authorized the employment of any suitable vessel in the Navy, and provided that the National Academy of Sciences should prescribe the scope of the scientific observations. An old tug of nearly 400 tons burden, rechristened under the name of Polaris, was selected, overhauled, and strengthened. Hall sailed from New York June 29th, the party consisting of Captain Buddington, sailing master; Dr. Emil Bessel, chief of the scientific staff; R. W. D. Bryan, astronomer; Sergeant Frederick Meyer, signal corps; meteorologist; 7 petty officers, and a crew of 14, together with its faithful servants Joe and Hannah. The Polaris was provisioned and equipped for an absence of 2½ years, and her voyage was destined to be over the route made famous by the expeditions of Kane and Hayes, through Davis Strait and northward along the west coast of Greenland, although Hall was at first uncertain whether he would not enter Jones's Sound instead of Smith's Strait. The usual visits to the Greenland ports were made, with resulting stores of furs, dogs, sledges, and other paraphernalia for exploration in the far north. To this point the expedition was convoyed by the man of war Congress, which bade the Polaris Godspeed as she left Godhaven on her lonely journey. Hans Hendrik, the Eskimo dog traveler, whose services with Kane and Hayes commended him to Hall, accompanied the expedition with his wife and children. It was a strange meeting between Morton, the second mate, and Hans, the Eskimo, who, 20 years before, as subordinates of Kane, had made together the memorable sledge journey from Rensselaer Harbor along the Humboldt Glacier to Cape Constitution. The Polaris was favored by an unusually open sea. Melville Bay was crossed in 48 hours, and the north water beyond was so free of ice that the Polaris kept her way unchecked until she reached Hakluyt Island. Even here the ice pack was so open that the Polaris easily forced her way. Littleton Island was passed on the evening of August 27, 1870, and later, crossing the parallel of Rensselaer Harbor, the Polaris attained a higher latitude than any former vessel on this route. Kane Sea and Kennedy Channel proved equally free of ice, so that the Polaris, steaming uninterruptedly northward, entered the Arctic Ocean, hitherto inaccessible, where she was finally stopped by an impenetrable pack in 82° 26' north. This point was more than 200 miles directly north of the farthest reached by Kane's vessel, the Advance. From this vantage ground it was seen that the eastern coast line of Grinnell Land extended somewhat farther to the north before turning to the west, and that, on the other hand, the coast of northern Greenland trended very nearly eastward. Strenuous, though unavailing, efforts were made to push the Polaris further northward. Failing this, attempts were then made to find a safe harbor to the eastward, but none was accessible. In the meantime, the main ice pack of the Arctic Ocean, setting southward to its normal position, carried the Polaris steadily to the south, through Robinson Channel, a distance of nearly 50 miles, and nearly caused her destruction by forcing her on the Greenland coast. Fortunately, the pack opened somewhat, so that the vessel was enabled to change her position and secure safe anchorage. This place, later named Thank God Harbor, at 81° 37' north, 61° 44' west, was sheltered by a bold cape to the north, while the Polaris was protected from the polar pack by an immense ice floe called Providence Berg. This enormous floe berg, grounded in 100 fathoms of water, was by direct measurement 450 feet long, 300 feet broad, and towered 60 feet above the level of the sea. Preparations were at once made to put the crew in winter quarters, and on shore an observatory was built for scientific purposes. To the surprise and delight of the party, seals proved to be quite abundant, and a small herd of musk oxen was found, the first of these animals ever seen on the west coast of Greenland. Leaving his chief of the scientific staff and his sailing master to their respective duties, Hall decided on a preliminary sledge journey in order to determine the best route for his contemplated journey of the next spring toward the Pole. A heavy fall of snow ensured good sledging, and enabled him to leave Thank God Harbor on October 10th, he being accompanied by the first mate, Chester, the Eskimo, Joe, and Hans Hendrik, with 2 dog sledges and 14 dogs. In a journey of 6 days he attained Cape Brevoort, in 82° north, on the north side of Newman Bay, a considerable distance to the southward, however, of the point reached by the Polaris in the Arctic Ocean. In a dispatch written at this point, Hall says, "From Cape Brevoort we can see land extending on the west side of the strait to the north, a distance of about 70 miles, thus making land, as far as we can discover, about 83 degrees 5' north. To illustrate the accuracy of Hall's judgment and his freedom from making extravagant claims, it may be stated that the detailed surveys of the British Arctic expedition of 1876 show the most northerly point on the east coast of Grinnell Land, Cape Joseph Henry, which possibly could be seen by Hall, was in 82 degrees 55', or within 10 miles of the position assigned it from a distance of 70 miles. Hall returned to the Polaris on October 24th, speaking most encouragingly of his prospects and planning another sledge journey for the autumn. Within an hour, however, he was taken violently ill, and upon examination Dr. Bessels announced that he had been stricken with apoplexy, that his left side was paralyzed, and that his sickness might prove fatal. After an illness with delirium for several days, he improved materially and was even able, through his clerk, to arrange the records of his late sledge journey, but a recurrence of the attack caused his death on November 8, 1871. The death of Hall left the expedition without a head. However, Captain Buddington, the sailing master, and Dr. Bessels, the chief of the scientific staff, signed an agreement to do all in their power to fulfill the ultimate object of Hall's ambition. Desultory efforts to go northward by boat were made without success the following year, and the only expedition which had definite result was one on foot by Sergeant Meyer, of the Signal Corps of the United States Army, during which he reached Repulse Harbor, 82 degrees 9' north, on the shores of the frozen Polar Sea, at that time the most northerly land ever attained. The future of the Polaris expedition does not strictly pertain to Hall. However, the winter was marked by a series of valuable physical observations made by Dr. Bessels and Mr. Bryan, the astronomer. In August, 1872, it was decided to return to the United States. Pushed into an impenetrable pack, anchored to a floe, the Polaris drifted with the main ice pack down Kennedy Channel, through Kane Sea, and into Smith Sound, where, on October 15, 1872, off Northumberland Island, the pack was disrupted by a violent gale, which freed the Polaris. Part of her crew, left upon the ice pack, experienced the horrors of a midwinter drift southward of 1,300 miles, and were picked up off the coast of Labrador by the sealer Tigress in the spring of 1872. The Polaris drifted to land in Lifeboat Cove, near Littleton Island, where the party built winter quarters on shore, known as Polaris House. In the succeeding summer they built boats from the remains of their ship, by means of which they reached Cape York, where the contemplated journey across Melville Bay was rendered unnecessary by falling in with the whaler Ravenscraig, which took them to England. The geographical results of Hall's last expedition were extensive and valuable. Not only was the Polaris navigated to the highest point then ever attained by a vessel, but the very shores of the Polar Sea were visited and explored. Hall carried northward and completed the exploration of Kennedy Channel, outlined the coast of Hall Basin and Robinson Channel, extended Grinnell Land northward nearly 2 degrees of latitude to practically its extreme limit, added materially to the northern limits of Greenland, and charted a very extensive portion of its northern coast. Unfortunately for the general credit of the expedition, the accurate observations and conservative estimates of Hall were not adhered to, and in their stead were published, under government auspices, a chart of Hall's discoveries which proved misleading in many of its details, extravagant and unreliable in its claim of new northern lands. The fidelity, accuracy, and importance of Hall's Arctic work is recognized, especially by his American and British successors in Smith Sound. Nares, in his official report to Parliament, states that the east coast line of Grinnell Land agreed so well with Hall's description that it was impossible to mistake their identity. Their bearing also, although differing upward of 30 degrees from those of the published chart, agreed precisely with his published report. Thus Hall merited the commemorative inscription on the brass tablet which the British Polar Expedition of 1875, with a generous appreciativeness creditable to its own brave men, erected to Hall's memory over his lonely northern grave. It recognizes Hall as one who sacrificed his life in the advancement of science, and further recites that they, following in his footsteps, have profited by his experience. End of Chapter 11. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 12 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 12. George Washington de Long and the Siberian Arctic Ocean. Of all the routes followed by explorers attempting to extend northward our knowledge of unknown lands, there is one which, more than all others, seems to have been closed by nature to the daring enterprise of man. While successful voyages to the northward of America and along the meridian of Spitzbergen have been of frequent occurrence, yet it has been the fortune of one expedition only to penetrate the vast ice pack that covers the Arctic Ocean to the north of Siberia, and give an account thereof. This expedition, organized through the munificence of James Gordon Bennett, Jr., and known to the world as the Jeannette Expedition, was commanded by De Long, then a lieutenant commander of the United States Navy. George Washington de Long was born in New York City, March 22, 1844, and entered the United States Navy by graduation from the Naval Academy in 1865. He rose to be a lieutenant commander and rendered ordinary naval service until 1873, when special duty fell to his lot, which turned his thoughts to Arctic research. The rescue of the drift party of the Polaris naturally caused great alarm as to the safety of the remainder of her crew, and with the dispatch of the Tigress into the waters of Smith Sound came orders for the Juniata, to which De Long was attached, to visit the coasts of western Greenland for additional search for the missing explorers. The Juniata proceeded to Upper Nivik as far as it was deemed safe for the man of war to venture. But its brave and sagacious commander, Captain D. L. Braine, of the Navy, thought it most necessary to search the vast inshore ice of Melville Bay, along which he correctly surmised they would conduct a retreat by boats. For this duty, novel, hazardous, and difficult, De Long promptly volunteered. For this dangerous trip the steam launch Little Juniata, some 32 feet long and 8 wide, was selected. Her crew consisted of Lieutenant Chipp, Ensign May, Ice Pilot Dodge, who had served with Hayes, and 4 others, while she was equipped and provisioned for 60 days. In this small craft, De Long, following the fast ice, reached a point immediately off Cape York, when he was struck by a violent gale. The sea was so heavy that his only chance of safety lay in carrying sail, steam being useless, to keep the boat under control. The violence of the wind disrupted the inshore ice, threatening the launch continually. Owing to fog, the presence of immense icebergs made navigation more dangerous than ever. High seas constantly broke over her, soaking everything on board and harassing the crew with the imminent danger of swamping. 30 hours the gale lasted, leaving the party in the last stages of exhaustion, wet to the skin and benumbed with cold, with closed floes to the north and east and the dangerous middle pack to the west. Under these conditions De Long reluctantly abandoned the search and returned. This brief experience created an interest in northern work which never abated, and as a result De Long, the voyage ended, approached James Gordon Bennett, Jr., who was favorable to his projects. Nothing, however, was done until November, 1876, after the return of the Nares expedition, when the exploration was decided on, but no vessel could be procured. Eventually, Sir Allen Young, an Arctic explorer of note, was persuaded to sell the Pandora, in which he had twice made polar voyages. The ship was, by act of Congress, given an American register under the name of Jeannette, strengthened under naval supervision, and put in commission under the orders and instructions of the Secretary of the Navy, with full discipline and force, but the expense of the expedition, repairs, equipment, and pay, was met by Bennett. On July 8, 1879, the Jeannette sailed from San Francisco, commanded by De Long, and officered by Lieutenant Ship, Master Dannenhauer, Chief Engineer Melville, Dr. Ambler, an ice pilot, 2 scientists, 24 petty officers and men. The route selected by De Long was via Bering Strait, apparently under the impression that Wrangel Land was continental in extent, an idea supported by the German geographer Petermann, whose advice De Long had sought, and along the shores of which coursed the northern current that swept forever out of the vision of man such whalers as were fully beset by the ice pack north of Asia. Before pursuing his own exploration, De Long, in compliance with instructions from the Navy Department, made search for the Vega, in which ship Nordenskjold, circumnavigating Europe and Asia, had wintered at Cape Serdze Kamen, in 65° 12' north latitude, on the northwestern coast of Asia. On reaching this point, he learned that the Vega had comfortably wintered and had passed south, thus confirming the report he had gained from the natives at St. Lawrence Bay. They at once steamed northward, thankful, as De Long records, that Nordenskjold was safe, and we might proceed on our way toward Wrangel Land. Ice was soon fallen in with, and after preliminary efforts to proceed directly to the north, which impenetrable floes prevented, De Long, on September 5, 1879, got up a full head of steam and entered the pack through the best-looking lead in the general direction of Herald Island, which was plainly visible at a distance of 40 miles. It was De Long's intention on leaving San Francisco to explore this land the first winter, but completely beset by heavy floes in 71° 35' north latitude, 175° west longitude, his ship never escaped. In hopes that information of value might be had from a visit to Herald Island, an unsuccessful attempt was made to reach it by dog sledge over the fast cementing pack, but the party was turned back by impassable leads. It soon became evident that the Jeannette was drifting steadily with the entire pack. First, the direction was to the north, taking the ship out of sight of Herald Island, but next it changed to the southwest, bringing that land again in view. While the drift was by a devious and very irregular course, yet it was in the general direction of northwest from 71° 35' north and 175° west at besetment to 71° 15' north and 155° east, when the ship was finally crushed by the pack. In investigating the cause of the drift, De Long says, "As to the currents in this part of the Arctic Ocean, I think our drift is demonstrating that they are the local creation of the wind for the time being. As our drift in resulting direction has been northwest since our besetment, so the greater amount of wind has been from the southwest. Our short and irregular side drift east and west, and occasionally to south, being due to correspondingly short and irregular winds from northwest or east." The party settled down to their regular life, which, though very monotonous, soon had an element of excitement and danger introduced that never passed away in entirety. This was threatened disruption of the pack, which, seemingly without cause, would change its form and position with such suddenness and violence as to endanger the safety of the ship. On November 13, 1879, without warning, the pack separated on a line with the ship's keel, the port snow wall being carried with the pack 150 feet away, leaving open water that fortunately froze over before other violent changes took place. De Long writes, "This steady strain is fearful. Seemingly we are not secure for a moment. Living over a powder mill, waiting for an explosion, would be a similar mode of existence. I sleep with my clothes on, and start up anxiously at every crack of the ship's frame." Almost by intervention of Providence, as it seemed, the Jeannette escaped destruction from these violent disruptions, which, except that of January 19, 1880, left her, during the first winter, comparatively unharmed. On that day, with terrible groaning and grinding, the main pack was fearfully agitated. No large openings were seen, and the ice acted as though its entire periphery was subjected to steady and irresistible pressure, which being toward the center caused the whole surface to buckle up irregularly. Enormous pieces of ice piling up under the stern of the Jeannette brought a tremendous longitudinal pressure on the ship and broke her forefoot, which caused a serious leak. It was only through the indomitable energy and great professional skill of Melville that the leak was got under control and later cared for without taxing greatly their precious stock of fuel. The winter passed with all in health, save Danenhower, whose eyes, becoming diseased, necessitated several operations and permanently placed him off duty for the voyage. The summer of 1880 came, found them fast embedded in the ice, and went without release. Autumn passed, winter came, and even the opening year of 1881 found them with conditions unchanged, as De Long recites: "A disabled and leaking ship, a seriously sick officer, an uneasy and terrible pack, constantly diminishing coal pile and provisions, and far from the Siberian coast." A break came, however, with the discovery of new land in May, along the north coast of which the Jeannette drifted slowly. On May 31st a party was sent to examine the island, for such it proved to be, Melville being in command, as ship was then on the sick list. Melville, despite the open condition of the ice, succeeded in landing on June 3, 1881, his third day out. He was obliged to carry his instruments and provisions, at the risk of his life, through the moving pack. It proved to be a desolate, ice-capped, rocky islet, almost destitute of vegetation, and inhabited only by dovekies, who nested in the inaccessible cliffs adjoining the discharging glaciers. Another island appearing, De Long named the two Jeannette, in 75 degrees 47 minutes north, 159 degrees east, and Henrietta in 77 degrees 8 minutes north, 158 degrees east. The end of the besetment came at last. On June 12, 1881, in 77 degrees 15 minutes north, 155 degrees east, the pack showed signs of great pressure. The immense floes seemed to be alive in their motion, and despite all efforts, the Jeannette was terribly nipped, her bows being thrown high in air. It was evident that escape was hardly possible. Steps were immediately taken to abandon ship, and everything of value or use was speedily withdrawn, with boats, sledges, etc., to a safe distance. Early the next morning the ice opened a little, and the Jeannette immediately sank, with colors flying in 38 fathoms of water. De Long and his party thus found themselves adrift in the Polar Sea, more than 300 miles from the nearest point of the mainland of Asia, and about 150 miles from the new Siberian islands. While the condition of affairs seemed desperate, De Long never despaired. Lieutenant Danenhower being disabled and ship sick, De Long's main dependence was in his chief engineer Melville, who was well, strong, energetic, and fertile in expedients. They had 5 boats, 2 very small, 9 sleds, provisions for 60 days, ammunition, instruments, and records, a terrible load for the party, as 5 men were off duty, and several others too weak to do their share in the drag ropes. There remained, however, 20 dogs, whose utility was questionable, as they soon consumed more in weight than they ever hauled. The ice was very rough, large openings were frequent, snow often impeded progress, roads had to be made, and on occasion all the stores and men had to be ferried across wide water lanes. At the beginning there was so much baggage that 7 separate loads were hauled, causing the men to travel 13 times over the same road, but this was soon unnecessary as the weights were gradually reduced. To add to De Long's discouragement, he discovered that they were under the influence of a northwest drift, and after 6 days' travel due south were 28 miles further north than when the ship sunk. He refrained from discouraging the men by this information, but changing his course to the southwest, got out of the drift. On July 11th land was discovered, and turning toward it, the shipwrecked and exhausted men reached it July 28, 1881. It was in 76 degrees 38 minutes north, 148 degrees east, and was called Bennett Island. Landing was effected by ferrying and crossing heavy, fast-moving floes, and the danger was greatly enhanced by the low water, which made it extremely dangerous work to attain the surface of the overhanging ice foot. The cliffs were alive with birds, which was a welcome change of diet to the sick men especially. The island was quite mountainous, with several grass-covered valleys. A seam of coal was found, and signs of considerable animal life. Recuperated by their 9 days' rest, the party started south on August 8th and landed on Thaddeus Island of the New Siberian group, August 20th, 1881. It is unnecessary to dwell on the dangers and hardships which this unprecedented journey entailed on the members of this party, which were met with fortitude, courage, and energy that made its successful issue one of the most notable efforts in the history of man, overcoming obstacles almost insurmountable. This remarkable journey had been so far made alternately by sledge and boat, owing to the broken condition of the polar pack. From Thaddeus Island, however, an open sea enabled them to proceed in boats, which were respectively commanded by De Long, Chip, and Melville. On September 12th, a severe storm separated the boats off the Lena Delta. Chip, with 8 men, were lost, while Melville, with 9 others, reached a small village through one of the eastern mouths of the Lena. De Long landed in 77 degrees 15 minutes north, 155 degrees east, September 17th, with Dr. Ambler and 12 men, having been obliged to abandon his boat owing to the shallowness of the river. He took with him the ship's records, arms, ammunition, medicines, necessary camp equipments, and 4 days' provisions, which were carried on the men's shoulders. Fuel proved abundant, and Alexey and their interpreter killed 2 deer, thus improving the situation. Retarded by the presence of sick men and by the weight of cumbersome records, they followed slowly southward the barren shores of the Lena, traveling through snow and over ice which broke readily. Their feet were soon in terrible condition, and eventually an ulcer on Ericsson's foot rendered partial amputation necessary on September 29th. De Long then records the terrible situation. They were confronted by a tributary of the Lena, which must freeze before they could cross, and as to Ericsson, if forced along, he could not recover, and if I remained here and kept everybody with me, Ericsson's days would be lengthened a little at the risk of our all dying from starvation. Ice formed in a couple of days, and they proceeded, dragging Ericsson on a sled. October 3rd, food entirely failing, their dog was killed and cooked, giving them strength the following day to reach a deserted hut large enough to hold the party. Here they were storm-stayed 2 days. Ericsson dying, Alexey hunting unsuccessfully, the drifting snow and piercing cold, all these served to plunge the party into despair. De Long writes, "What, in God's name, is going to become of us? 14 pounds of dog meat left and 25 miles to a possible settlement. Read the burial service and carried our departed shipmate's body to the river where he was buried." Their last food was eaten October 7th, and nothing remained except old tea leaves and 2 quarts of alcohol. But Alexey shot a ptarmigan, of which a thin soup was made. On October 9th, the exhausted condition of some of the men and an open, unfordable creek debarred further progress of the party as a whole. In this contingency, De Long sent Nindermann and Norris ahead for relief, with orders to keep the west bank of the Lena until they reached the settlement. Later, De Long advanced a mile and camped in a hole in the bank. Alexey killed 4 ptarmigans, and the party resorted to their deerskin clothing for subsistence, but without avail. The last entry in De Long's diary, October 30th, 1881, records all dead except Collins, who was dying. Ah Sam and Dr. Ambler, of whom no mention was made. Norris and Nindermann, after a march of 120 miles, reached Bulcour, which they found deserted. Seeking shelter in one of the vacant huts, they were discovered by a native who took them to an adjacent encampment. The native either did not understand Nindermann or were unwilling to go northward, for despite his incessant and urgent entreaties, they carried the 2 seamen southward to Boulogne, where they arrived on October 29th and met Melville and his party. This energetic officer, exhausting all practicable means, pushed his relief parties northward to the extremity of the Lena Delta, but without success. He reached the Arctic Ocean, recovered the log books, chronometer, and other articles on November 14th, when a severe storm obliged him to abandon the search. Renewing his efforts in March, 1882, he discovered, on the 23rd of that month, the bodies of his companions. An official inquiry as to the general conduct of the expedition caused the board of officers to express their opinion that the general personnel were entitled to great praise for their solidarity and cheerfulness, their constancy and endurance. The zeal, energy, and professional aptitude of Melville were noticed, and special commendation given to De Long for the high qualities displayed by him in the conduct of the expedition. The scientific observations of the Jeannette expedition must be of considerable value, involving as they do hydrographic, magnetic, and meteorological observations over an extended portion of the earth's surface previously unknown, and it appears surprising that after all these years they remain undiscussed. In addition may be noted the importance of De Long's hydrographic contributions, covering some 50,000 square miles of polar ocean, which indicate with equal clearness the character of 50,000 other square miles of area to the south, and thus prove the Siberian Arctic Ocean to be a shallow sea dotted with islands. The geographic results are represented in part by the attainment of the highest latitude ever reached in Asiatic seas, and in the discovery of Jeannette, Henrietta, and Bennett Islands. Discoveries, however, are both direct and indirect, and to positive results should be added successes of an inferential though negative character. Through De Long's northwest drift, the long sought-for Wrangel Land shrank from its assumed dimensions as a continent, connecting under the Petermann hypothesis Asia with Greenland, to its reality, a small island. It is to be said that this reduction of Wrangel Land into a little island doomed De Long's expedition to certain failure, and closed Bering Strait as a promising route to high latitudes. For the Arctic canon of Perry yet obtains that without a sheltering coast no vessel can hope to navigate safely the polar ocean. With the march of time it is not to be expected that geographic problems connected with the vast ice-covered ocean to the north of Siberia will be left unsolved. These coming explorers may be more fortunate than was De Long, and while profiting by his experiences they will surpass his efforts, yet their successes cannot make greater demands on the courage and constancy of them and their subordinates than were shown by the gallant De Long and his associates in the fateful voyage of the Jeannette. End of Chapter 12. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 13 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 13. Paul Belloni du Chaillu, discoverer of the dwarfs and gorillas. Among the thousands of vigorous and adventurous men whom chance brought to light in foreign climes, but who by choice have cast their lot with America by becoming citizens of the United States, there are few whose explorations and discoveries have excited more popular interest and discussion than have those of Du Chaillu, the discoverer in modern times of the dwarfs and the capturer of the gorilla. Born in Paris, July 31, 1835, the early environments of Paul Belloni du Chaillu fostered and forecast his taste for African exploration, for his father was one of the adventurous Frenchmen whose consular appointment and commercial enterprises led him to settle at the mouth of the Gaboon, on the west coast of Africa, where his distinguished son passed his boyhood. While young Du Chaillu was, doubtless, well grounded in ordinary sciences by his instructors, the learned Jesuit fathers, of Gaboon, yet apart from regular educational institutions, he imbibed other wealth of learning by observation of the rich tropical world around him, and also through a familiar intercourse with neighboring tribes acquired a knowledge of native tongues and craft, of savage habits and character, which ensured his after success in African exploration. Commercial pursuits brought Du Chaillu to the United States in 1852, when he was so strongly impressed by American institutions that he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. Du Chaillu was brought prominently before the American public by a series of striking and interesting articles on the Gaboon country, which, from their favorable reception, strengthened his belief in the importance of thoroughly exploring certain portions of the west coast of Africa. The region selected for his investigations was under the burning sun of the equator, somewhat to the north of the Congo country, in the basins drained by the Muni, Ogawi, and Rembo rivers, which, owing to difficulty of access, extreme heat, prevailing fevers, and deadly climate, were practically unknown. Between 1856 and 1859 Du Chaillu journeyed upward of 8,000 miles through this country, traveling on foot, with no white companion, and with the aid of natives, cursorily explored nearly 100,000 square miles of virgin territory. Working with the ardent zeal of a naturalist, his enormous ornithological collection aggregated thousands of specimens, and in this collection alone he added some 60 new species of birds to the domain of science. Among the quadrupeds he discovered no less than 20 new species, and among the most important animals brought to light were the very remarkable nest-building ape, with its unknown and its almost equally extraordinary brother, the kulalamba, and his observations of the almost unknown gorilla were most interesting and valuable. In ethnology he accumulated a number of invaluable native arms and implements, which now adorn the British Museum. Space fails in which to recite his intense sufferings, during these explorations, from semi-starvation, the wild beasts of the dense forests, the venomous reptiles of the river valleys, the attacks of ferocious ants and other intolerable poisonous insects which infest the interior. There are many interesting accounts of curious quadrupeds in Du Chaillu's book, Adventures in Equatorial Africa, but none appeals more strongly to most readers than that of the gorilla. Traditions from antiquity, the relation of Hanno, the Carthaginian navigator of 350 B.C., set forth the existence of such an animal, but no white man had ever seen a gorilla, except Andrew Battell, early in the 17th century. Nearly 10 years before the explorations of Du Chaillu, the gorilla had been, however, brought to the notice of naturalists by Dr. Savage of Boston, who had received a skull from the Reverend J. L. Wilson, an American missionary on the Gaboon. From boyhood up Du Chaillu had heard from the natives of Gaboon fearful stories of the cunning, strength, and ferocity of this ape, which is the most dreaded animal on the west coast of Africa. For years he had longed for an opportunity to hunt the gorilla, and when he first saw its tracks, which threw his native hunters into alarm, he relates that his sensations were indescribable, his feelings so intense as to be painful, and his heart throbs so violent that he actually feared the animal would be alarmed by them. Du Chaillu chronicles the end of his first successful hunt as follows: "Before us stood an immense male gorilla. He had gone through the jungle on his all fours, but when he saw our party he erected himself and looked us boldly in the face. He stood about a dozen yards from us, and was a sight, I think, never to forget. Nearly 6 feet high, he proved 2 inches shorter, with immense body, huge chest, and great muscular arms, with fiercely glaring, large, deep gray eyes, and a hellish expression of face, which seemed to me like some nightmare vision. Thus stood before us this king of the African forests. He was not afraid of us. He stood there and beat his breast with his huge fists till it resounded like an immense bass drum, which is their mode of offering defiance, meantime giving vent to roar after roar. The roar of the gorilla is the most singular and awful noise heard in these African woods. It begins with a sharp bark like an angry dog, then glides into a deep bass roll, which literally and closely resembles the roll of distant thunder along the sky, for which I have sometimes been tempted to take it where I did not see the animal. So deep is it that it seems to proceed less from the mouth and throat than from the deep chest and vast paunch. He again sent forth a thunderous roar, and now, truly, he reminded me of nothing but some hellish dream creature, a being of that hideous order, half man, half beast, which we find pictured by old artists in some representations of the infernal regions." The explorer relates that flying gorillas so resemble men running for their lives, and their discordant cries seemed so human, that he felt almost like a murderer as he shot them. Having obtained a number of specimens, he now used his utmost endeavors to obtain an ape alive, and speaks of his success as one of the greatest pleasures of my life. To his great grief, however, the intractable and savage brute soon died. Regarding it, Du Chaillu writes: "Some hunters who had been out on my account brought in a young gorilla alive. I cannot describe the emotions with which I saw the struggling little brute dragged into the village. All the hardships I had endured in Africa were rewarded in that moment. It was a little fellow of between 2 and 3 years old, 2 feet 6 inches in height, and as fierce and stubborn as a grown animal could have been. Several were captured from time to time, but all died after short confinement. Every effort to subdue their ferocity, whether by force or by persistent kindness, utterly failed. They were never other than morose, bellicose, and treacherous." Another very interesting animal is the nest-building ape, a before unknown species, which was discovered by our explorer almost by accident. Du Chaillu says: "As I was trudging along, rather tired of the sport, I happened to look up at a high tree which we were passing, and saw a most singular looking shelter built in its branches. I asked Oboko whether the hunters here had this way to sleep in the woods, but was told to my surprise that this very ingenious nest was built by the Nshiego Mbuve, an ape. The material is leafy branches with which to make the roof, and vines to tie these branches to the tree. The tying is done so neatly, and the roof is so well constructed, that, until I saw the Nshiego actually occupying his habitation, I could scarce persuade myself that human hands had not built all. It sheds rain perfectly, being neatly rounded on top for this purpose. The material being collected, the male goes up and builds the nest, while the female brings him the branches and vines." Yet another member of the ape family, discovered by our explorer, deserves passing notice in his own words. "The Kulu Lamba has for distinctive marks a very round head, whiskers running quite around the face and below the chin. The face is round, the cheek bones prominent, the cheeks sunken, the jaws are not very prominent, less so than in any of the apes. The hair is black, long on the arm, which was, however, partly bare. This ape, whose singular cry distinguishes it at once from all its congeners in these wilds, is remarkable as bearing a closer general resemblance to man than any other ape yet known. It was very rare, and I was able to obtain but one specimen of it. This is smaller than the adult male gorilla and stouter than the female gorilla. The head is its most remarkable point. This struck me at once as having an expression curiously like an Eskimo or Chinaman. Among the worst pests of Africa are ants, especially the bashikouay, which travel in a line about 2 inches wide and often miles in length. Du Chaillu says: "They devour and attack all with irresistible fury. The elephant and gorilla fly. The black men run for their lives. In an incredibly short time a leopard or deer is overwhelmed, killed, and eaten. They seem to travel day and night. Often have I been awakened out of my sleep and obliged to rush from my hut and into the water to save my life. A Bashikouay army makes a clean sweep, even ascending to the tops of the highest trees in pursuit of their prey." The results of his 4 years of research in the interests of ethnography, geography, and natural history were placed before the public in a valuable work entitled Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa. The book gave rise to bitter, harsh, unjust criticisms and engendered endless discussions. Du Chaillu's journey to the interior was entirely discredited, and his accounts of the animals and natives were characterized as mere fabrications. Discoveries necessarily develop discrepancies between the realities brought to light and existing beliefs produced through inference or imagination. Then, as has many other discoverer in science or geography, Du Chaillu learned how slow is the willingness of a jealous mind to relinquish its favorite error for a conflicting truth. Justification came speedily for the explorations of Serval and Belay of the very next year, proved the accuracy of Du Chaillu's account of the great Ogowe River, and indicated the general correctness of his map of the Ashira country. Burton confirmed his reports regarding the cannibalistic habits of the Fans, and other statements were speedily corroborated. Stung to the quick by the adverse criticisms, Du Chaillu, although suffering from the effects of fevers contracted in his long residence in western Africa, determined to repeat the journey with such precautions regarding his observations as would be absolutely convincing as to their truthfulness. Especially he determined to capture and bring to Europe a living gorilla. To ensure accuracy, he went through a course of instruction in the use of instruments, learning to make, test, and reduce astronomical and hypsometrical observations, and acquired proficiency in the then difficult art of photography. As regards geographical explorations, he had a vague hope that he might reach from the west coast of Africa some unknown tributary of the Nile, down which he might be able to reach the main river and the Mediterranean Sea. Leaving England in August, 1863, Du Chaillu's first destination was the mouth of Fernand Vaz River, about 110 miles south of the Gaboon, this point being selected both because he knew the natives and also because that river valley, being unknown, afforded him virgin ground from the beginning of his journey. In landing through the terrible surf that makes entrance into the Fernand Vaz so dangerous, Du Chaillu was nearly drowned, and all his astronomical instruments and medicines were lost or damaged. This necessitated his delay in that region until other instruments could be had from England, but the time was not lost, for he had ample opportunity of further studying the habits of the gorillas, which abound there. Fortunately, he captured 4, an adult and 3 young, one of which he shipped alive to London, but it died during the voyage. Du Chaillu started on his journey with 10 Komi negroes, previous survivors, as his bodyguard, and 50 porters in place of the 100 needed, thus making double trips necessary for a while. Following up the Fernand Vaz River to its tributary, the Rembo, he left this latter stream at Obinchi and traveled southeasterly to Olenda. Here a council was held by the local chief, who forbade him to enter the Apingi country, but allowed him to proceed to the Ashira region, where he was long delayed and robbed by the natives. In crossing the Nguni River, on his way eastward to the Ishogo country, he was surprised to obtain ferriage in a large, flat-bottomed canoe which carried baggage and party across in 7 journeys. Near the end of June, while traversing a tract of wild forest near Yongwe, Du Chaillu came suddenly upon a cluster of most extraordinary and diminutive huts, which he was told were occupied by a tribe of dwarf negroes. In his previous journey in the Apingi country, he had given no credence to the exaggerated descriptions and reports that had often come to his ears concerning dwarf tribes, assuming the stories to be fables. Now, however, with these curious huts before him, he pressed on, eager to obtain personal information concerning these little folks, whose existence had been vouched for centuries before the Pomponius Mela, Herodotus, and Strabo, and who were described in a fairly accurate way by Andrew Battell in 1625. In answer to Du Chaillu's inquiries, the natives said that there were many such villages in the adjacent forests, and that the tiny men were called the Obongos. He found the huts entirely deserted, but from scattered traces of recent household effects, it was quite evident that the Obongos, alarmed at the approach of strangers, had fled for safety to the dense jungle of the neighboring forest. He thus describes their habitations. The huts were of a low, oval shape, like a gypsy tent. The highest part, that near the entrance, was about 4 feet from the ground. The greatest breadth was about 4 feet also. On each side were 3 or 4 sticks for the man and woman to sleep on. The huts were made of flexible branches of trees, arched over and fixed into the ground at each end, the longest branches being in the middle, and the others successively shorter, the whole being covered with heavy leaves. On June 26, 1864, Du Chaillu entered Nyembowai, a large village in Ashangoland, in the vicinity of which, he learned with great joy, was situated an inhabited encampment of the Obongos. or hairy dwarfs, as he terms them. The Ashango natives offered to accompany him, at the same time intimating that it was likely the village would be found deserted, for, said they, the Obongos, the dwarfs, are shy and timid as the gazelle and as wild as the antelope. To see them, you must take them by surprise. They are like to the beasts of the field. They feed on the serpents, rats, and mice, and on the berries and nuts of the forest. Du Chaillu made his first visit to an Obongo encampment with 3 Ashango guides, and with great precaution they silently entered a village of 12 huts to find it long since deserted. Fortune was more favorable at the second village, where, however, no one was to be seen on entrance. The curling smoke, calabashes of fresh water, and a half-cooked snake on living coals indicated that the alarmed inhabitants had fled on their approach. A search of the huts resulted in disclosing the presence of 3 old women, a young man, and several children, who were almost paralyzed with fear at the sight of an unknown monster, a white man. By judicious distribution of bananas, and especially of beads, Du Chaillu succeeded in allaying their fears, and later made several visits, but confidence was never firmly established, and it was impossible to see the men except as they fled at his approach, or at a distance when they visited the Ashango village for purposes of barter. During his several visits he carefully measured 6 dwarf women, whose average height proved to be 4 feet 6 1/8 inches. The shortest was 4 feet 4 1/2 inches, and the tallest 5 feet and 1/4 of an inch. The young man, possibly not full grown, measured 4 feet 6 inches in height. Du Chaillu says, "The color of these people was a dirty yellow, and their eyes had an untamable wildness that struck me as very remarkable. In appearance, physique, and color they are totally unlike the Ashangos, who are very anxious to disown kinship with them. They declare that the Obongos intermarry among themselves, sisters with brothers. The smallness and isolation of their communities must necessitate close interbreeding, and I think it very possible this may cause the physical deterioration of their race. Their foreheads were very low and narrow, cheek bones prominent, legs proportionately short, palms of hands quite white, and their hair short, curly tufts, resembling little balls of wool, which, according to the young man seen by Du Chaillu, grew also in plentiful, short, curly tufts on his legs and breast, a peculiarity which the Ashangos declared was common to the Obongo men. These dwarfs feed partly on roots, berries, and nuts gathered in the forest, and partly on flesh and fish. They are very expert in capturing wild animals by traps and pitfalls, and in obtaining fish from the streams, and the surplus of flesh is exchanged for plantains and such simple manufactured articles as they stand in need of." Concerning their settlements and range of migration, Du Chaillu adds, "The Obongos never remain long in one place. They are eminently a migratory people, moving whenever game becomes scarce. But they do not wander very far. These Obongos are called the Obongos of the Ashangos. Those who live among the Njavi are called Obongo Njavi, and the same with other tribes. Obongos are said to exist very far to the east, as far as the Ashangos have any knowledge." In his Journey to Ashangoland, Du Chaillu gives quite a number of words of the Obongo language. He considers their dialect to be a mixture of their original language with that of the tribe among whom they reside. It appeared that none of the dwarf women could count more than 10, probably the limit of their numerals. Their weapons of offense and defense were usually small bows and arrows, the latter at times poisoned. Leaving Mobano, 1° 53' south latitude, and about 12° 27' east longitude, by dead reckoning, Du Chaillu passed due east of the village of Muaou, Combo, where he, by accident, while firing a salute, one of his body guards unfortunately killed a villager. An effort to atone for the accident by presents would doubtless have been successful, but most unfortunately, and despite Du Chaillu's strict orders, his bodyguards and porters had already irritated the Ashangos by offensive conduct. Overtures for blood money were interrupted by an offended chief denouncing the exploring party. Almost instantly the natives commenced beating their war drums, and Du Chaillu, realizing the danger and loading his men with his most valuable articles, retreated westward toward the coast. Before they reached the forest, he and one of his men were wounded by poisoned arrows. Pursued by the infuriated savages, Du Chaillu restrained his men from shooting. When, demoralized by the situation, many of his porters threw away their loads, which consisted of notebooks, maps, instruments, photographs, and natural history collections. Curiously enough, the instruments and goods thus abandoned by Du Chaillu in 1864 were found in 1891 by an African trader, in the jungle where they had been thrown down by the retreating carriers, having remained all these years untouched by the Ashangos, who believed they were fetish and so regarded them with superstitious dread. After retreating a few miles, and finding that inactivity and self-restraint meant self-destruction, Du Chaillu took the offensive, and, drawing up his men in a favorable position, repelled his pursuers with considerable loss. The wounds from poisoned arrows being external, if subjected to immediate treatment, healed in a few weeks. Further explorations under these circumstances were impossible, for Du Chaillu depended entirely for his success on friendly relations with the natives. In consequence, he returned to the sea coast, and on September 27, 1865, quitted the shores of western equatorial Africa. Although the second voyage of Du Chaillu into the unknown regions of western equatorial Africa rehabilitated his reputation as a reliable observer, as far as related to geography and natural history, yet his description of the Obongo dwarfs gave rise to further discussion and aspersions. It is needless to say that the discoveries of Stanley in his last African expedition have definitely settled this question in Du Chaillu's favor, and that the studies of Lenz, Marsh, and Bastian in and near the region visited by Du Chaillu confirm the accuracy of his descriptions. Indeed, the Obongos of Ashango Land rise in proportion to undersized negroes when compared with the dwarf queen found by Stanley on the eastern edge of the great equatorial forest, who measures only 2 feet 9 inches in height. Thus in time has come complete vindication of all of Du Chaillu's statements as to the wonders of the Ashira and Ashango lands, which portions of western equatorial Africa he was the first to explore. If the geographical extent of his explorations give way to that of other African travelers, yet it must be admitted that he stands scarcely second to any in the number, importance, and interest of his contributions and collections in connection with ethnography and natural history of equatorial Africa. In later years, Du Chaillu has devoted his attention to the northern parts of Sweden, Norway, Lapland, and Finland, and although his travels in these regions had no important geographical outcome, yet they resulted in lately placing the general public in possession of many interesting details of these countries, as given in his book called The Land of the Midnight Sun. His important work, The Viking Age, is an elaborate presentation of his theory that the ancestors of the English-speaking races were Vikings and not Anglo-Saxons, and has awakened much comment in the scientific world. Ivar the Viking, his latest book, is a popular account of Viking life and manners in the 3rd and 4th centuries. End of chapter 13. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 14 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 14. Stanley Africanus and the Congo Free State. The largest, the richest, and the least known of the great continents is Africa. Despite its vast area, numerous tribes, and complicated interests, it may be said that its potential influences as regards to the rest of the world have been alternately retarded and advanced through the efforts of 4 individuals. The jealousy of Rome, excited to its highest pitch by the eloquence of the elder Cato, resulted 146 B.C. in the annihilation of Carthage, an industrial center whence for 5 centuries had radiated toward the interior of Africa peaceful and commercial influences. 8 centuries later, the hordes of the Arabian Caliph Omar in turn overwhelmed the Roman colony at Alexandria, destroying forever its literary influence by the burning of its great library. Conversely, the missionary labors of David Livingstone from 1849 to 1873 inculcated peaceful methods and cultivated moral tendencies destined to introduce Christianity and develop civilization. Not only did Livingstone, in the eloquent words of Stanley, weave by his journeys the figure of his Redeemer's cross on the map of Africa, but scattering ever his Master's words and patterning his life after the Master, stamped the story of the cross on the hearts of every African tribe he visited. Initiating routes of travel, suggesting new commercial fields, and organizing stable forms of government, came a man of harder metal, of indomitable will and courage, Henry M. Stanley, who merits the title of Stanley Africanus. A Welshman by nativity, born near Denbigh in 1840, he came to the United States at the age of 16, and thenceforth cast his lot with America, and as a citizen of this country made his explorations under its flag. It is reputed that he exchanged his natal name of Rowlands for that of Henry M. Stanley, for a merchant of New Orleans who adopted him, but in any event his early life was passed without the loving and modifying influences of a home, his youth almost equally destitute of those adventitious surroundings that properly mold the character and ensure opportunities for success to young men. Thus he stands forth a self-made man, to whom strength has been accorded to develop the manhood that God implanted in his soul. Stern experiences in the American Civil War, brief life in the Far West, and special service in Turkey had shaped Stanley into a reliant, self-contained man when his first African journey came to him in 1868 through assignment as newspaper correspondent to accompany the British Army in its invasion of Abyssinia. He participated in this wonderful campaign, which led him 400 miles through a country of indescribable wildness and grandeur, across rugged mountains, along deep valleys, up to the fortress-crowned crest of Magdala, 10,000 feet above the sea. Difficult as were the mountains of Abyssinia, they were less dangerous than the African region later to be traversed by him, a journey unsought, but which came to him as the fittest man for the time and service. A telegram and 5 hours' preparation carried Stanley from the blood-red fields of revolutionary Spain into the famous search journey that gave to an anxious world news of the long-lost Livingstone. For 20 years this great Scotch missionary had carried the gospel of Christ and its civilizing influences from one end of Africa to the other. Once he had crossed the continent in its greatest breadth, and now, vanished from the sight of the civilized world in his renewed missionary labors, for 2 years his very existence had been problematical. The search expedition owed its inception and maintenance to James Gordon Bennett, Jr., whose brief orders to Stanley were, "Find Livingstone, and bring news of his discoveries or proofs of his death, regardless of expense." The personnel, methods, and arrangements devolved entirely on Stanley, but his preliminary route was to lie through certain countries. It thus occurred that between Madrid, his starting point, and Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika, the camp of Livingstone, he saw the gaieties of Paris, was present at the eventful opening of the Suez Canal that revolutionized Eastern commerce, ascended the lower Nile to scrutinize with interested eye Baker's prospective expedition to the Sudan, divined, under the mosques of the Bosphorus, the political riddles of Sultan and Khedive, examined the uncovered foundations of Solomon's Temple in the Holy City, meditated over the historic battlegrounds of the Crimea, penetrated the Caucasus to Tiflis for news of the Russian expedition to Khiva, and, traversing Persia through the Euphratean cradle of the human race, entered India, whence his route lay to Zanzibar and the dark beyond. What a contrast those preliminary journeys afforded, across effete countries whose varying and recorded phases of civilization are contemporaneous with the history of the human race, to the threshold of a vast region whose barbaric freshness is such that its entire history lies within the memory of living man. Stanley landed at Zanzibar January 10, 1871, and fortunately was at once impressed with his ignorance of outfitting, which he thought he had learned from books. Resorting to the Arab traders, he proved such an apt pupil and skillful organizer that he enlisted 27 soldiers, gathered 157 carriers, and 5 special employees, which, with 2 white assistants, Farquhar and Shaw, made his aggregate force 192. He had his African money, beads as copper coins, cloth as silver, and brass rods as gold, canvas-covered boats for navigation, asses and horses for special work, fine cloth for tribute to local chiefs, which, with tentage, medicine, etc., made some 6 tons of freight. March 21, 1871, the rear guard marched out of Bagamoyo, the town on the mainland opposite Zanzibar, and taking a route never before traveled by a white man, Stanley reached Zimbabwe in 14 marches, the journey of 119 miles having occupied 29 days, during which the commander came to fully realize the difficulty of his undertaking, the inefficiency of unpracticed subordinates, and the uncertain loyalty of carriers. The onward march resembled all in Africa, thorns and jungle to wound the naked carriers, rivers to be forded or crossed on almost impracticable bridges, swamps many miles in length and so miry as to tax the utmost strength and energy of man and ass, insolence and exactions of local potentates, thefts by natives, desertions of carriers, the oft-recurring fever, and occasionally a death. The 20th of May, Stanley was at Mpwapwa, Mbambwa, delighted physically at its fair aspect and upland picturesqueness, but mentally anxious over Farquhar, whom he left here sick, and the loss of his asses, which he fortunately was able to replace by 12 carriers. He reached on June 22nd Unyanyembe, after a devious journey of 520 miles to cover an airline distance of 150. Here had just arrived a relief caravan for Livingstone, which had left Zanzibar 4 months prior to Stanley's. Nearby at Tabora, the chief Arabian town of Central Africa, Stanley was surprised to find the Arabs at war with the savage chief, Mirambo, thus barring the usually traveled road to Ujiji. Here Stanley lost 3 months, and participated in an unsuccessful campaign with the Arabs against Mirambo, vainly hoping that thus his road would be opened. 5 of his men were killed in the war, others deserted, so that only 11 carriers remained, and altogether his prospects of success steadily diminished. Despairing of the old route, Stanley, having with great difficulty recruited his force of carriers, decided to try a circuitous trail to the south in order to reach Ujiji, which lay to the northwest. Failure and destruction were predicted, but with confidence in himself, Stanley, on September 20th, marched on with Shaw and 56 others. Illness caused him to soon send back Shaw, his only white companion. Frequent desertions weakened his force. An incipient mutiny of his panic-stricken men on the Gombe River threatened complete destruction to the party. Insolent chiefs exacted extortionate tribute. Desert marches without water and scant food discouraged and weakened the men, but the leader pushed on with unflagging energy despite every obstacle. His route lay through Igonda, Itende, the beautiful country of Uvinsa, across rocky Uha to the Malagorazi River, where his heart was gladdened by rumors from the natives that a white man had lately arrived at Ujiji from Maniwema. Pushing on with feverish haste, on November 9, 1871, he had the indescribable joy of looking down on magnificent Lake Tanganyika, and on the following day, with his gigantic guide Asmani proudly striding in advance with the Stars and Stripes as his standard, Stanley marched into Ujiji and there accomplished his mission by meeting Livingstone and ascertaining the results of his late labors. Livingstone's primary mission, the suppression of the slave trade by means of civilizing influences, had not materially progressed, but he had strong hopes of the future. Geographically, however, he had been most successful, having made important discoveries in the watersheds of Lakes Tanganyika and Nyanzas, and found an unknown river with Lualaba, which in a later exploration Stanley proved to be the Upper Congo. Stanley found Livingstone with only 5 carriers and without means of trade. Supplying all deficiencies from his own stores, he assisted Livingstone in his exploration of Lake Tanganyika, and the twain returned together to Unyanyembe. In the meantime, both Farquhar and Shaw died, and Stanley, turning over his supply stores to Livingstone, bade him farewell and Godspeed, and started for Zanzibar. On March 14, 1872, 8 weeks later, Stanley was again enjoying civilization at Bagamoyo, while Livingstone was awaiting means of returning to his life task, soon to be ended by his death among the tribes he loved. For greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Over 4 months of intercourse with Livingstone steadily increased Stanley's admiration for this great man. He describes him as a high-spirited, brave, impetuous, and enthusiastic man, with these qualities so tempered by his deep, abiding spirit of religion as to make him a most extraordinary character. In all his relations with his servants, with the natives, and with Mohammedans, Christianity appeared in its loveliest and most potent forms, constant, sincere, charitable, loving, modest, and always practical. It was this abiding faith in God which made Livingstone a man of unfailing devotion to his sense of present duty, of wondrous patience, unvarying gentleness, constant hopefulness, and unwearied fidelity, qualities which made his missionary work in Africa unprecedentedly successful. Abuse, misrepresentation, and incredulity from geographic societies, critics, and press greeted Stanley's account of his discovery of Livingstone, and only gradually did his traducers yield to the convincing evidences of his astonishing success. Turning to his old work, Stanley, in the winter of 1873-74, again entered Africa, accompanying as newspaper correspondent the British Army, which invaded to a distance of 140 miles the deadly marshes of the Ashanti Kingdom, and destroyed its capital city, Kumasi. When the deaths of Livingstone brought Africa into prominence again, Stanley, believing he could complete so much of the missionary's work as concerned exploration, turned thither at the head of an expedition under the auspices of the London Telegraph and the New York Herald, the object being the survey of the lacustrine system at the head of the White Nile and a journey thence westward across the continent. Leaving Bagamoyo, November 17, 1874, Stanley reached Lake Victoria Nyanza in March 1875, his journey of 720 miles being marked by pestilential fevers, struggles through thorny jungles, and scant food and water. Circumnavigating the lake, he found it to be over 4,000 feet above the ocean, while its proportions, nearly 22,000 miles in area and in places over 500 feet deep, assumed these of an inland sea. Here Mtesa, a powerful and able Negro king of Mohammedan faith, proved most friendly and greatly aided him, furnishing an escort which enabled Stanley to explore a part of the adjacent mountain region. From Ujiji he then explored Lake Tanganyika, finding it to be about half the size of Victoria, with an elevation of about 2,700 feet. Important as were these discoveries, they paled before others made in following the Lualaba River of Livingstone, which changed the map of Central Africa and altered the destiny of that vast and untraversed region. The journey to Nyangwe, Livingstone's farthest, entailed horrible hardships on the carriers. This Arab village was reached via the Luama, which, of hitherto unknown course, was found by Stanley to be an affluent of the Lualaba. At Nyangwe, Stanley felt that his accomplished journey of over 800 miles from the east coast promised well for his coming voyage to a known point on the other coast, 900 miles due west. He made an agreement with an Arab, Tipu Tib, trader in human flesh, or ivory as chance offered, to escort the expedition about 600 miles west through the unknown regions. The country proved to be primeval forest, almost trackless, its tropical undergrowth a veritable jungle of thorns and vines. Game was scanty and other food equally so. Finally, progress was so slow and the path so devious that Stanley, yielding to his appeals, discharged Tippu Tib and decided to descend the river by canoes and his frame boat. He embarked at Vinya Njara with 150 in his party on December 28, 1876, entrusting himself with sublime audacity to a river flowing no one knew whither, save it was away from civilization, and with the knowledge that the country they were entering was peopled by tribes entirely hostile and intractable, as a slave trader said. Day after day they drifted steadily to the north. Was it or was it not the Nile of Livingstone's prediction? Then, day by day, the course trended to the east. Yes, it could only be the Nile. After 240 miles, the trend was to the northwest, whither, week after week, for about 300 miles, it kept its puzzling flow toward a point of the compass where it could join no river known to man. It had, too, assumed proportions and volume truly Amazonic, filled with islands and swollen from 1 to 7 miles in width. All efforts to gain a knowledge of its final course were then fruitless. For the few barbarous natives they could win to speech answered in uncouth jargon, scarcely intelligible to the interpreters. It is the river, the river. The terrors of the silent stream in its majestic solitude were almost preferable to the presence of populous villages, which here and there lined its banks, for the inhabitants, ferociously hostile for the greater part, refused trade and boldly assaulted them. Skillful canoemen and good archers, the savages slaughtered unwary stragglers, harassed the rear and attacked the front, while their horrible threats that the bodies of the slain would serve as food at their cannibalistic repasts instilled terror in the minds of many of Stanley's followers. Skirmishes were frequent, and now and then a severe fight which taxed Stanley's forces to the utmost. Again the river had here and there series of cataracts which caused no end of trouble, delay, and danger to the party, 9 men being drowned in one day. Fortunately the river had turned to the south, and then to southwest, where, after another 1,000 miles, it flowed through a narrow gorge 150 miles from the sea, so that no doubt longer obtained as to it being the Congo. The terrible falls near the gorge entailed enormous labor to pass them, and barely failed of destroying the party. In all, 28 cataracts were passed, and finally the river became so precipitous, the falls so high, that they had to abandon their boats and march overland to Boma, an English trading post 5 days' journey distant. Fatigue, famine, and exposure further enfeebled them, and now made daily inroads among the ranks of those who had so far survived, and the entire party would have perished on the very threshold of civilization and plenty had not Stanley's messengers, sent on with urgent appeals, obtained help at Boma, where the expeditionary force arrived August 12, 1877. They had made a river journey of 7,000 miles, proved the Congo to be second only to the Nile, and crossed Africa. When Stanley, in 1877, entrusting his life and fortunes to a mighty and unknown stream, voyaged toward the very heart of the Dark Continent, even his wildest dreams could not have foreshadowed results equal to the reality of a near future. His voyage in its potentiality was second only to that of Columbus, as the outcome of the succeeding 5 years plainly indicates. All Europe, alive to the commercial importance of the Congo basin, hastened to reach its borders or encroach on its limits by means of enlarged, dependent colonies. Commerce and religion, hand in hand, traversed its rivers by steam and lined its banks with beneficent settlements, while the merciless Arab devastated its villages and dragged its decimated natives into slavery. Then came a political wonder, the peaceful creation of a vast tropical empire more than 1,000,000 square miles in area, the Congo Free State, erected and admitted into the community of nations by act of an international conference in which participated 14 European powers and the United States, our own country being fittingly the first to officially acknowledge the existence of the new state its adventurous citizen had given to the world. The voyage through the Dark Continent was obviously potent of future results, and Gambetta, in 1878, clearly forecast the effects of Stanley's journey. The great French statesman said, "Not only have you opened up a new continent to our view, but you have given influence to scientific and philanthropic enterprises which will have its effect on the progress of the world. What you have done has interested governments, proverbially so difficult to move, and the impulse you have imparted, I am convinced, will go on year after year." Slowly recovering from the effects of famine and fatigue incident to this arduous journey, Stanley returned to Europe in January, 1878, and was met, as he stepped out of the express train at Marseilles, by two commissioners of King Leopold of Belgium, who informed him that His Majesty contemplated a new enterprise in Africa and desired his assistance. While heartily endorsing the proposed work of Leopold, his physical condition was such that active cooperation was impossible, and he was even unable to visit His Majesty. 5 months later, with physical energies renewed, after a visit to Leopold, Stanley eventually agreed to the proposition which contemplated the establishment of a grand commercial enterprise for controlling the trade of the valley of the Congo. It involved the erection of commercial and military stations along the overland route and the establishment of steam communication wherever available. In short, a colony of Europeans was to be founded in the Congo basin, whose great fertility, healthy climate, and enormous population seemed to especially favor the development of African civilization. The action of Leopold evidently grew out of Stanley's declarations that the question of this mighty waterway, the Congo, will become a political one in time, and his conviction that any power possessing the Congo would absorb the whole enormous trade behind, as this river was and must continue to be the grand commercial highway of West and Central Africa. Stanley accepted the mission, visited Zanzibar, where he enlisted 68 Zanzibari, mostly his old soldiers, and by sea reached Banana Point, on the west coast, August 14, 1879. 2 years previous he had reached this place after descending the newly discovered Congo. Now he was re-entering its fertile basin in order to establish civilized settlements, with the intention of subduing Central Africa by peaceful ways, and to remold it into harmony with modern ideas, so that justice and order should ever obtain, violence and the slave trade forever cease. He returned to Europe in 1882, his success far exceeding the expectations of the committee. In this time, with the aid of 68 Zanzibari and a few Europeans, he had constructed 3 trading stations, launched a steamer on the upper Congo, established steam communication between Leopoldville and Stanley Pool, and also constructed wagon roads between Vivi and Isangila, Manyanga, and Stanley Pool. He pointed out to the committee the imperative necessity of a railroad between the lower and upper Congo in order to preserve uninterrupted communication, which scheme was approved by the committee provided Stanley would take charge of the work. Although his health was impaired, he agreed to return to the Congo and complete the establishment of stations as far as Stanley Falls, which he duly accomplished, not leaving Africa until there were 5 promising trading posts: Vivi, Leopoldville, Kinshasa, Stanley Pool, Equator, and Stanley Falls, the last about 2,000 miles inland from the west coast. On Stanley's return to Europe, the question of organizing the basin of the Congo into an independent state was agitated. As a result, 14 of the European powers and the United States united in a conference at Berlin and formally agreed, on February 22, 1885, that the entire Congo basin should be erected into a nation to be known as the Congo Free State. Thus, less than 8 years after Stanley's famous journey, he beheld the country that his genius had rescued from oblivious darkness erected into a new state and admitted into the community of nations. The last journey of Stanley into Africa was for the rescue of an Egyptian governor of Equatoria, Edward Schnitzer, a German by birth, better known as Emin Pasha. On the death of General Gordon, by whom he was appointed governor, Emin had been left to his fate at Wadelai by the Egyptian authorities. from which point he wrote on December 31st, 1885, saying that for 19 months he had been forgotten and abandoned. On July 6, 1886, he wrote beseeching help. In this contingency the sum of £21,500 was raised, £10,000 from the Egyptian government, the rest subscribed in England, for the expenses of a relief party, and all eyes turned to Stanley as a natural leader. He was engaged in a very profitable lecturing tour in the United States when the expedition was finally decided on. 3 days after the receipt of a cablegram that his plans were accepted, Stanley sailed for Africa via England, using such dispatch that he had his expedition of 680 men, 61 being Sudanese soldiers, ready to leave Zanzibar on February 25, 1887. Stanley decided to make the journey by vessel around the Cape of Good Hope to the Congo, by which river he expected to get within 200 miles of Lake Albert. The cooperation of the infamous Arab trader, Tipu Tib, the most powerful trader in Africa, was obtained by making him governor of Stanley Falls in the Congo Free State. Following the Congo to the Aruwimi, Stanley turned up that stream and camped at Yambuya, about 60 miles above the mouth and over 1,300 miles from the sea. To this point he had lost 57 men, and now divided his forces as follows: advance guard under himself 389, Yambuya garrison 129 under Major Bartolot, other supporting guards in rear 131, original force 706. On January 28, 1887, Stanley started for Lake Albert, 330 miles distant in an air line, through an entirely unknown country. It proved to be a virgin forest, the greatest of the world, through which a path had to be cut almost the entire distance. For 160 days they marched through an almost unbroken forest, bush, jungle, marsh, and creek. The scattered villages, filled with barbarous and hostile tribes, were abandoned at their approach. Poisoned skewers, covered with green leaves, were planted in the paths, and twice the party was attacked. On October 6th affairs came to a crisis, as provisions had failed, save scanty wild plants. Many, stricken with disease, including Stairs, one of the officers, could go on farther. No less than 126 men had been lost by death and desertion, about half from each cause, and all must perish unless the party divided. Stanley left Nelson and 52 men in camp on Ituri River, about 1 degree 5 minutes north, 28 degrees 30 minutes east, and started ahead for relief. After terrible privation and nearly perishing of starvation on the way, they reached Ipoto, October 17th, where food was purchased from the natives. As soon as possible, Jeffson, Stanley's able and loyal assistant, returned to Nelson's relief and brought him and 3 men to Ipoto, 9 carriers having died and 40 deserted. December 4th, Stanley, with 175 men, emerged from the forest and 9 days later reached Lake Albert, whence Wadelai, Emmons Station, was distant 4 days' journey by water or 25 by land. Finding no boats on Lake Albert, Stanley was obliged to retreat from its desolate shores westward to a fertile region, where he built Fort Bodo and planted crops, while a detachment brought up his steel boat, in which Jeffson reached M'Swa and was met on April 26, 1888, by Emin, who had been notified by Stanley's native courier. 2 days later, Emin and Stanley met at Lake Albert, when propositions and plans as to Emin's movements were made and discussed with no definite results. The equation of Emin's character seems to have been best stated by Vida Hassan, his friendly subordinate for 20 years, who considers Emin's many virtues as those of a missionary rather than of a governor or commander, and attributes his infirmity of indecision to innate goodness of heart. It was 9 months before Emin, his army mutinous, himself and Jeffson imprisoned, with death as an alternative, decided to return with Stanley to Zanzibar. In the meanwhile, Stanley, anxious as to his rear guard, returned through the dreaded forest, hoping from day to day to meet it, but saw no signs until he reached Banalya, on the Aruwimi, a few miles from where he had left it. Here he found it in a state of inactivity and disorganization, its chief, Major Barttelot, murdered by a native, Jameson and 102 out of the original 276 dead, and 26 deserted. Again, the journey through the forest and its hostile tribes to Lake Albert, where Stanley, with the hesitating Emin Pasha and his followers, started for Zanzibar on April 1, 1889. The return journey, made as far as Lake Victoria, Nyanza, over unknown ground, resulted in the discovery of Mount Ruwenzori, a snow-clad peak under the equator estimated to be 17,000 feet high. Moreover, of vastly more importance, Stanley ascertained that Lake Albert Nyanza, through the Semliki River, drained a large lake named Albert Edward, thus determining the secret of the long-sought and ever-retreating source of the White Nile. Small streams feed Lake Albert Edward from the south, whose extreme limit is placed by Stanley in 1° 10' south latitude. December 4, 1889. Found, the party arrived at Bagamoyo, the coast town opposite Zanzibar. The work which Stanley was sent to do, as all other tasks assumed by this great explorer, was ended, and Emin Pasha once more looked on the faces of his countrymen. Crowned with highest honors from all the powers of Europe, no tribute, as Stanley has said, gave such gratification as that from the United States, which, proud of the achievements of its great citizen, extended to him an unprecedented honors of its official, well-considered, and merited commendation, wherein under date of February 7, 1878, it was resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives in Congress assembled that, regarding with just pride the achievements of their countryman, Henry M. Stanley, the distinguished explorer of Central Africa, the thanks of the people of the United States are eminently due and are hereby tendered him as a tribute to his extraordinary patience, prudence, fortitude, enterprise, courage, and capacity in solving by his researches many of the most important geographical problems of our age and globe, problems of a continental scope involving the progress of our kind in commerce, science, and civilization. The End. End of Chapter 14. Recording by William Tomcho. End of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely.